Now it is my really great honor to do a very brief introduction to Assemblywoman Jonelle Millman, who represented the 52nd Assembly District, which I believe includes this college, for 17 years until her retirement in 2014. She became a St. Francis Scholar in Residence in January 2016 and has moderated a number of panels, including a really wonderful one on women in government. I had given that as an extra credit assignment to my students that semester, and many of the students, some of whom are in the classroom today, were from different countries and wrote these wonderful papers comparing the situation in their country to what it is in ours, and about your talk, which was very inspiring. She's invited many prestigious guests to our campus, Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez, Assemblywoman Joan Simon, and our very own State Senator Roxanne Persaud. She's very committed to educating our children and advocating for our seniors. She led a panel here at the college on aging in the urban environment, and in general in protecting our environment, because you were very active in the creation of the Brooklyn Bridge Park and in cleaning up the Brooklyn waterfront, which is something that we as members of the St. Francis community are grateful for every single day. And so closely related to today's topic, Assemblywoman Millman served on the New York State Assembly Committee on Election Law, where she worked tirelessly to increase access to voting. Remember to vote. If you missed primary day this week, remember to vote in November. To limit the influence of special interests in elections, and to level the playing field between candidates. Therefore, it is my great honor to welcome today Assemblywoman Joan Millman. Thank you.
Real pleasure to be back here during your fall term and to change the focus of the prior discussions that I led back in the spring term. And some of you I know were there for some of those. But today is Constitution. We're celebrating Constitution Day. And so it seemed very appropriate that we talk about the Constitution, and I think as we titled our discussion today, doesn't the Constitution guarantee your right to vote? Well, I brought my copy of the Constitution with me, which is such an amazing thing because it's this tiny little book, you know, but it's all in there, you know, and if you get a copy of it, it really is impressive reading, because remember how long ago they wrote it, all right? And also the things that they've changed through the years. Initially, you couldn't vote in this country unless you owned property, which meant that whole classes of citizens could not vote, because they never had access to owning property. We know that women didn't get the right to vote for decades and decades and decades. And that's begun to change the landscape of what politics in this country look like. Also would like to point out that if you look at foreign countries, so many of the leaders of foreign countries are women. And yet in our country, that's not happened yet. If you look at the population in New York State, for example, and the number of women in the population, and yet the number of women who represent us in both Albany, whether it's the Assembly or the State Senate, and the number of women who represent us on the City Council does not coincide with the numbers, the percentage of women who actually live in our states. So before we get more into the conversation, I wanted to acknowledge our female district leader, Ann Zwern. Thank you, Ann, for being here. And to thank her in particular for providing us with our guest speaker today, because this is a woman who, and I've just had the opportunity to meet her myself for the first time. I hope it's not the last time, all right?
As do
But
I.
thank you, Susannah. Susannah is a special litigation attorney who works in Brooklyn. And she was very impressed with what you had to say about where you're working, all right? Because this is what she does. She works on constitutional issues in the criminal justice system. And she's really focused on government violations of individuals' civil rights. And we're going to talk about a lot of that today and what's been going on nationally very recently in our own country. She graduated from Columbia and received her doctorate with distinction from Stanford Law School. So she's and she works with the Brooklyn Defenders, which is how Ann Sworn knows her so well. So Ann, I know that's what it says in there, but why don't you give us just a few more highlights of your career, if you will, what you do at Brooklyn Defenders.
Sure. Absolutely. So my background beginning back in law school and as an undergraduate, actually, like many of you, I studied political science and women's studies and African American studies together and tried to major in all three, wrote my thesis in all three. And of course, the principle there was to try to understand the difference between majorities and minorities and how those dynamics work together to create political realities. I then went to law school I was a much older student, and so I was already in my 30s by the time I went to law school, and had a pretty clear idea about what I wanted to do. And I come from a very marginalized community, and knew that I wanted to turn my attention toward how it came to pass that some of these political outcomes had come to be. And particularly with regard to the criminal justice system. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, the tough on crime era, and an entire generation of young men had been wiped out of my community without a huge understanding on my part about what had brought us to this place. So I made it my business to try to understand some of those dynamics, to understand the laws and the dynamics behind it, the political realities behind it, and dedicated my career to being a civil rights lawyer. I began at Howard Law School because I was pretty intent on becoming a radical civil rights lawyer and really, exposing that which I knew to be true. And from there, I transferred to Stanford, who was it was a better resource school to allow me to the freedom and the opportunity to do what it was that I wanted to do. I got involved in 3 strikes work, which is 3 strikes and you're out, if you've heard that terminology before. The idea that if you commit 2 crimes, your 3rd crime, you get a life sentence, no matter what it was. And in California, where I went to law school, it was a particularly punitive version of that law. So I became very involved in exploring the underlying constitutional issues involved when we designate certain segments of society to be permanently disenfranchised, which we're talking about today, to be permanently discarded from our society, to be removed from the body politic. What are the standards that we employ to make those kinds of decisions? What remedies and opportunities do people have for redemption? The answer is not many. Sorry, that's the punchline. Particularly here in the state of New York, where we have no expungement, we have we have some things that are especially great about our laws here in the state of New York, and some things that we have to work on and a ways to go in terms of making sure that people have full and robust political participation. But basically, it was through the lens of 3 strikes that I became very concerned about the constitutional dimensions of the criminal justice system. That led up to Proposition 36 in California a few years ago, where we were able to roll back some of the more punitive aspects of the 3 strikes law. I became a litigator. I went to court a lot. I was able to have some success in some of those cases where I represented lifers in prison who were petitioning the government for their freedom. So that was the tail end of law school. I became a public defender in Santa Clara County. Shortly following, I worked in major felonies and did sentencing motions, trying to convince courts to give people that had perhaps made some serious mistakes another chance, or perhaps something more proportional to what it is that they had done. So I focused a lot on punishment. I was very fascinated with punishment, who we punish, why we punish, what grounds we use to punish, what authority we have to punish, what we tell ourselves about why we're punishing, whether or not it keeps us safe. I've just become very concerned as an attorney about, especially what our founding documents, what our Constitution has to say about the parameters of punishment and who gets it and why. And actually, that's what the entire document, small and brief as it may be, is about. It's about the conditions under which the government might intervene into your life, and it's about the relationship between the governed and the government. It doesn't define our relationships between one another. It defines a relationship between the government and the governed. And it basically, it only defines it insofar as it says these are the only circumstances in which you may intervene with private citizens, and under all other circumstances, you must not. And so that becomes a very important parameter to understand criminal justice, criminal defense in particular, where an individual citizen stands accused versus the people of the state of New York, us, all of us, and our public safety and our common collective good. And so that, I think, is kind of my relationship to constitutional law, has been through the prism of the criminal justice system and trying to understand the race dynamics, the gender dynamics, the constitutional dimensions of some of the problems that we look at every day and the outcomes that we read about in the newspaper, the things that we concern ourselves with as concerned citizens. So that's kind of what brings me to the conversation. And of course, if you are going to dig into the Constitution, you can't just specialize in one part of it. You kind of have to have an appreciation for the entire document and how those pieces fit together to create a system of governance that is harmonious.
So now that's what you've done in the past.
That's
right
right.
now you are working
I'm at the Public Defender.
Defenders.
That's right.
And what do you do there?
So it's a bit of a weird title. My title is Special Litigation Counsel to Brooklyn Defender Services, and so I act as counsel to the Public Defender. We carry about 40% of the cases here in Brooklyn, which comes out to about 45,000 arrests per year. Which is a lot. So we represent a whole lot of people, and my role there, so this is a public defense office with investigators and social workers and an immigrant defense practice, a family defense practice, a wide range of practice areas. My role is to kind of monitor the entire docket of all of those arrestees, all of those clients, to spot out those clients who have issues that are emblematic or symptomatic of a systemic flaw. So if the thing that has happened to a specific client represents a larger flaw in the system, right? For example, if there's a statement that's been made under conditions that we think are an illegal interrogation, we would want to use that case as an example to make that constitutional point, and that would be my role. That case would become mine at that point. So my job is to work with the individual public defenders to identify major constitutional issues to make sure that we're doing the very best that we can to vindicate our clients' civil rights and their constitutional rights when their cases are still open. Traditionally, just as a footnote to that, I think traditional civil rights, which is my background, I worked at the Civil Liberties Union before I came to the Public Defender. And I think traditionally civil rights lawyers try to remedy violations after the fact by petitioning for damages or by trying to get an injunction, which is an order to an agency or to an entity to stop doing what you're doing from the court. And we had this novel idea at Brooklyn Defender Services that, the Constitution lives and dies in the arraignment part. The Constitution lives and dies in a suppression hearing. The Constitution lives and dies, where counsel is present and when a person is actually being accused and when those procedures are actually taking place. And so we proceeded with the very uncontroversial idea that we vindicate the Constitution where it stands, which is often in open criminal court, and try to add to the high quality of the criminal justice system by doing a better job in the first instance, rather than waiting for the violation to be complete and then trying to create some kind of remedy after the fact, but to try to avoid the violation in the first instance.
So with a workload like that, we're really
No big
very
deal.
thankful that you were able to squeeze time in for us, right? But you did bring somebody with you today, and I'd like you to introduce him because
Oh, I
that was
will.
very nice of you to do that. Yes.
I did. I brought my partner. I brought Demetrius. Demetrius and I
Yeah.
went to high school together. Demetrius and I have known each other for 25 years, and we met in fourth period geometry class many, many, many years ago. So we grew up on the West Coast in Tacoma, Washington, and he just moved out here. It'll be a year next Friday.
Welcome.
So he's a brand new New York voter.
And registered, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, very good.
Absolutely.
That's always good to hear. Well, one of the things that that I really wanted to spend some time talking about today was the back in 1965, right? There were a couple of us who were around then, not too many of us looking at the audience here, but there were some of us who were around then. There was Civil Rights Act was signed into law by Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president. And that's the law that existed in its entirety for decades. And I can talk from personal experience because before I was the assembly member, I was also had the same job that Ann Zwern has today, which is the district leader in a district, and it was this district, the 52nd. And at that point, which was back in the 80s for me, there was something that was part of the Civil Rights Act called, I think it was Section 5, which is called pre-clearance. If any locality, county, state, wants to change anything about the voting, and they're considered a minority rights district, all right? They have to get pre-clearance for that change from either the Justice Department or a federal court in Washington. So anything as simple as, and what I wanted to do then, was to change a polling place from one location to another. I couldn't simply do that. I had to get documentation from both the district leaders who were Democrat and the district leaders who were Republican, from the site that had the polling place to the site that was willing to accept the polling place, and other documentation, and send that off to the Justice Department way before that coming election. And it got approved. And they still use that polling place today. That's a small change. Well, back in 2000, well, let me go back because I didn't really, minority voting rights districts are districts in which there is a high percentage of minority citizens, but those citizens don't vote for whatever reason. I mean, it was a protection so that the people in government couldn't arbitrarily change anything about voting until somebody outside of that district looked at it, like the federal courts or the Justice Department. So even as small a change as moving a polling place from one site to another had to get that pre-clearance. Well, in 2013, that provision was struck down. And so in this short span of time, which is less than 3 years, throughout this country, there have been measures that have been passed by state legislatures to change very dramatically things that go into making your right to vote easy. Now, New York State is pretty, if anybody here, I shouldn't ask because I don't really want to know, voted in the primary, because I'd like to see a lot of hands. I see, oh, that's great. Thank you very much. So what happened nationally is if you went to vote, and so many of you did, you walked in, you went to the right table if you knew where to go, or if someone directed you where your election district was. You told them your name, and they opened up this book, and they found your name, and then you signed it. And if the signature matched, reasonably matched what you had signed before, then they gave you, right, a form, and you went and you voted, and you put it in the scanner, and then your vote was counted. Well, in states, and let me talk about Texas, right? Texas is a really egregious example. They decided that people had to have photo ID. And the only thing that was acceptable in Texas was state-issued photo ID. So that meant if you had a driver's license, that's state-issued. It meant if you had a gun license in Texas that has photo, that was acceptable. But if you went to a state university in Texas and had photo ID, for some reason, that was not acceptable. Why? Exactly, right? Why? Thank you. It's a good question. I don't know why. Sounds a little discriminatory to me, right? A gun holder, you're acceptable. Student, not so much, right? If you had a passport, that's federal, that was counted as well. So there were people that took that provision of the Texas state law to court, and they won on that. But throughout the country, there are at least 11 states now that have some kind of litigation going on because they have tried to decrease the number of hours where you can vote. In New York City, you can vote anytime from 6 in the morning till 9 at night. Outside of New York City, the hours are different. In Connecticut, they're different. In New Jersey, they're different. But before, if we were to change the hours in New York and you lived in Kings County, Brooklyn, or you lived in Bronx or Manhattan counties, you had to get pre-clearance. Now we could just do that and nobody would look at it because there isn't that piece of the law in place anymore. They just took it out. And if they sued, and I don't know, maybe Susannah can tell me, it didn't work because it didn't, I know I was hooked up and mic'd and it just fell off, but I'll hold it. I'm still good? All right, I'll hold it. Now you all know what that looks like. When you see people on TV and they have it in the back of their pants or whatever, or their jacket, this is what it looks like, right?
State law, would the states be free, like would New York State be free to implement the laws to fill that?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And not all of New York State is a minority rights district, obviously, because some of the counties in Brooklyn aren't. And why do people vote or not vote? That's a personal decision. I'm one who says, I don't care how you vote, just vote. I have my own personal biases, of course, but I think people ought to vote. And one of the things that I've done today is I brought some, and I know that there's been a lot of movement here at the college and at colleges throughout our state to make sure that students vote. So I brought some voter registrations, and whether you, whatever you do, I always encourage people, young people, old people, middle-aged people, to pick a party. Because look at the presidential preference primaries last spring. If you were a Democrat, if you were a registered Democrat, you could vote in the presidential preference primary for your choice. If you were a Republican, you registered in the Republican Party, then you had more choices to make in that presidential preference primary. But if you weren't either a Democrat or Republican, then you couldn't vote in the primary. You can always vote as a registered voter in November, but you have no say in any primary. You were going to say something?
But
Yes.
only in New York, because there are some states
Yes.
that I remember saying that anyone could vote in any primary.
Yes.
And that skewed the results. You could just address that. Because you don't have to register.
No, there are some, they have open primaries, and they have states where they have caucuses for presidential primaries, right? And those caucuses, anybody can show up. A candidate who has some money can hire buses, load people up in the buses, take them to the caucus site, which may be inconvenient to get to, and then those people can participate in the caucus. So that does skew the results a little bit. But come November, that's a voting, and everybody is encouraged, and that's not something you forget about. Every 4 years, we get the biggest turnout nationally, because everybody knows about that vote. And especially when it's a presidential election, the numbers are really high, which is very encouraging. We always like to figure out why we can't get more people to the ballot box when it's not a presidential year. Because if you go to vote in November, you know, you have to vote early because it's going to be lines, there are going to be people. But it's faster now. I think the new scan machines work much more quickly. There are fewer lines, but you have to be prepared. But it's your democratic vote, and I mean it, you know, in the best sense. You really have to exercise that. And sometimes I'm impressed to see pictures in newspapers where countries where they never had voting, people are lined up for miles, waiting online for the opportunity to vote. And we kind of take that, I think, too much for granted. And some people say, well, I was busy. Well, everybody's busy, but you get to do it, right? Yes?
Don't go to vote?
Well, I mean, you can talk to penalties more than I can. But when I think of penalty, I think of financial penalty. And I think that shouldn't be. I mean, somebody doesn't vote, then you're going to charge them. It's like getting parking illegally, right? You get a fine and then you have to pay it. There has been some discussion, not very serious discussion, I don't believe, that we change the voting date to the day instead of the middle of the week where people work, may be more difficult, to a Sunday, right? And that way, that's not a work day, and maybe that would encourage more people to come out to vote. But that's a conversation that's still being held in many localities. Do you want to say something? Yes.
Or to make it a public holiday.
Yes, or make it, yeah, well, but election day is, you know, but not everybody's off on election day. You know, I mean, it is a holiday, but a lot of people still have to work. Well, the primaries on Tuesday, the turnout in districts that had primaries was anywhere from like 10 to 18%.
Yeah.
In national, it'll be higher than that,
Sure.
but nothing like that. There are, and it was alluded to before, people in cities in New York State really want to have their voting place like in their building or around their corner, where outside the city of New York, people get into their cars and drive to their polling place. And that's the way it is. But yeah, people like to have the convenience, and that's one of the reasons I believe that New York State it's open from 6 in the morning, so if you work during the day, you can go before you work. It's open till 9 at night, so that if you get out at 5 o'clock from work, you still have a couple of hours to get to the polling place. And that's been, especially in downtown Brooklyn, we know this from, you know, just anecdotally, and you know it too from looking at buildings in downtown Brooklyn. A lot of them are older, and they have stairs. And in fact, it's my understanding, and Ann can correct me if I'm wrong, that I think we're going to be having polling places at St. Francis in the fall, in the November election. That's what I've been told. That's a possibility that they're working that out. Because if you look around the buildings in downtown Brooklyn, even some of the schools, they're not handicap accessible. There are steps, and the steps you cannot use ramps because of the great, the slant of the steps. Not possible. So you certainly don't want to disenfranchise people from voting because of that. But one of the other things that's never been done in New York that they're doing now. You mentioned before that you're not happy that your polling place was changed, but people got notices. In some of these localities nationally, they'll just change a polling place now and not notify anybody. So
Surprise.
You show up, you show up at the place that you thought you were going to vote, and there's no voting. Nobody's there. It's not being utilized at all. Or they can change the hours and not tell you. So you go early and it's not open yet. And as a matter of fact, if you haven't voted yet, you're not registered, October 14th is the last day for you to register in order to vote in the November election. That's October 14th. So, and the election is November 8th. So, and that is generally not as well publicized as you think it ought to be. Yeah. They just don't, I have cable, I have New York One, and so they tell you on New York One inside City Hall every night they tell you. But you don't see it in many other places, not in the newspaper. If it's not being taught at school, how would you know? In fact, during last spring, there were table efforts going on in front of New York City Tech on Smith Street and NYU Poly, and they were for Bernie Sanders, and they were giving out literature, and they were encouraging mostly students to vote, but they hadn't checked the dates. So some of the students or people passing by, they couldn't vote in the primary because they didn't have enough time. When you look at the voter registration form, you will see there's section 14, I wish to enroll in a political party. There's Democratic Party, Republican Party, Conservative Party, Green Party, Working Families Party, Independence Party, Women's Equality Party, Reform Party, and then there's a box for other. And the point that we've made, that I hope you take away with you, is that the only primaries that we have in this state are either Democratic or Republican. But all the other parties, if you decide to enroll in one of them, certainly, or you enroll in no party, you're just registering, you can vote in the general election, whatever it's for, in November. Susannah.
Sure. Yes, please register, vote, pick a party, do your part, get involved, because not everyone can. And that's, I think, the natural segue is that, you started the conversation with sort of an historical perspective on the various gains in the franchise, beginning from the beginning. But I think it's, just to dial all the way back, the Constitution is very much an aspirational document, right? It's the finest articulation of freedom at a time when most American citizens were not free. It's aspirational, it's not self-executing, it is not a descriptive document, it does not describe what is, it tells us what we should aspire to. It's a hopeful thing, it's a dynamic thing, it's something we're supposed to be in pursuit of. And it's the franchise, it's your ability to vote, it's suffrage, it's your ability to get involved and make your voice heard that executes the document, right? In the law, when you sign a contract, it's called executing it, right? It means you're taking something from an idea into reality, right? And the Constitution as a concept and as an American ideal is purely aspirational until you can execute it, right? And that's really sort of the American experiment. It's, are we clever enough? Are we unified enough? Are we motivated enough to get out there and execute these ideals on our own behalf and on one another's behalf? And the way that we've decided to do that as a country is through a Republican democracy, right? That's where we get the party names from. It means that we don't all go out and pick laws like in ancient Greece. We don't, cast our, rocks into a bucket to signify whether we approve or don't approve of a particular law. Instead, we choose people, and they go make those decisions for us, right? That's the Republican part, right? Our democratic part is that we get to pick those people. The Republican part means then those people go in there and pick the laws, right? And they go in and they become the policymakers. So it's critical that American citizens understand how instrumental that vote is in how decisions are made on a local scale, from your school board all the way up to presidential politics and foreign trade and union politics. Like everything that you can imagine is implicated by the decision makers, right? By who is in power, who makes that policy, and who they believe that they're serving. And that's really a critical question. Elected officials know who they are serving. They are serving their constituents. Who are their constituents? Voters, right? So who gets to vote? Seems like a really important question. And over American history, we've really began talking about the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '68, and all of that led up to this idea that we should not be carving off whole sections of the population as non-voters because we've decided they're socially undesirable. That's really what voter discrimination was about. It wasn't about who can read, right? There were plenty of white farmers. There were plenty of people all throughout the country in states that had literacy tests, which is one of the discriminatory kind of voter suppression policies of the Jim Crow era in the South, to keep African American people from the ballot box, right? The whole idea had nothing to do with, oh, we want educated voters. That's all pretext, right? And of course that came out in various court cases where it was demonstrated that no, you're using literacy to stand in for whiteness or for land ownership or for something impermissible, right? It was a way to keep African American people from being heard and from selecting Democratic, right? Democratic Republican, from selecting their own leaders to go up into the halls of City Hall or the State Assembly or the Governor's Mansion and make those decisions on behalf of African American people. The whole idea was to carve out whole chunks of the population so that that voice would not be a part of the decision making that went on, right? Now, that's been true since the founding of this country. There has never been a full franchise in the United States, right? You mentioned initially it began with land ownership, right? So that was male, that was Christian, right? And that was white. And that, you could not own land unless you fell under one of those conditions. That has been expanded, right, to include different categories of people over time. But we still have this deeply American impulse to pick and choose who gets to participate. Right? And so we've had we've touched on this a little bit, but this idea that, how do we decide who gets to vote? Is it that we make it hard to register, right? We heard some conversation about, it's confusing. I don't know where to do it. There are deadlines. Why are there deadlines? Number one, states who are in charge of election law, right, except insofar as it touches on a constitutional issue like race, which is when you get preclearance. But usually state elections are a creature of state law, right? And so states get together and kind of decide how that's going to go. Some states, like Oregon, has recently made it compulsory. You're automatically registered to vote. You turned 18, hooray, you're registered. Surprise! And you have to choose to throw that away. You have to choose to you can ignore it if you'd like. Nobody's going to fine you, right? We're not going to penalize you for not exercising it. But you're automatically given the right to vote, and it's yours to lose. It's yours to lose. And there are some, narrow circumstances where you might lose that franchise, right? And we kind of know what those are. You can die. You can, right? In some states, if you're convicted of a felony, right? That's something I deal with a lot. In some states, you will never get the right to vote back. In other states, you can vote while you're in prison, serving time on your felony. In Vermont, for example. I think it's Vermont or New Hampshire, one of the two. But there are a few places where your franchise is never compromised by the fact of a conviction or by the fact of an accusation. Here in New York, there's a period of disenfranchisement, and you gain your right to vote back after your criminal justice contact has ended, after you've completed your parole or your probation. And a lot of people don't know that. Voters in New York sometimes assume, people that Ann and I serve, sometimes assume that their right to vote is forever gone, forever and ever, because in some states it is, often in the Deep South. I'm sure you can't imagine why that might be. But it's, there's a huge variety of how states, pursuant to their own state election laws, made by decision makers that are usually elected or appointed, how we choose our body politic, how we select the members of our citizenry that get to have a voice, that get to participate. And there are so many things that pair off whole sections, whether it's, throughout American history, these notions of who gets to be a citizen, what the concept of citizenship includes, that excluded women and people of color for so many years, and non-landowners. And then through different periods of history, we've excluded people convicted of crimes. We've excluded the recently immigrated. We've excluded all sorts of people for all sorts of reasons. And just mentioned the types of facilities that we use to conduct voting, right? That's to make sure we don't exclude people with disabilities, right? That it's not a valid reason to exclude whole groups of people from participating in a Republican democracy, right? So it's interesting to me, state by state, the huge variety that you'll get, depending on which side of a state line you're on, in what that state has done to ensure the franchise for as many people as possible. For some states, like Oregon, they want everybody to participate, and their state policies and state laws express that. Other states very clearly want to pick and choose a much smaller group of people who get to participate. Often you're going to see this in minority majority districts, where the people who are currently the decision makers are not necessarily reflective of the people who live in that area. In those types of areas, often you'll see state policies that are trying to exclude people from voting so that those decision makers can stay in power, right? Right, exactly. So you'll get a lot of variety, and it has very little to do with what good election policy is, and it has everything to do with who we as a society have decided we're going to allow to participate in a country that has as one of its cornerstone ethos that everyone gets to participate. And so it's a bit of a contradiction. And it's as American as apple pie. It's always been one.
We only have a few minutes left, but if you could just touch on, and I'm trying to think, there's a governor in a state who tried to overturn, try to allow more people who had served time to be able to vote.
That was North Carolina.
Was that North Carolina?
Or was it Virginia? It was Terry McAuliffe in Virginia, wasn't it?
Virginia, right.
That's
and I
right.
thought and the legislature overturned what he was doing. He was allowing people who had served time
That's right.
and finished with their incarceration
That's right.
were no longer on probation to allow them back onto the voter registration.
Right.
And he was doing it systematically as the governor of the state. And then the state legislature overturned that. And now now he has to do it case by case.
Right.
Is my understanding.
That's right, and that was sort of the question in that moment was who has the authority
to do that.
That's right.
Exactly.
And does the governor have the authority to grant some kind of collective relief, some sort of collective franchise to former felons, or is that on an individual basis? And
it's like the president granting amnesty almost.
Clemency, that's
Clemency,
right.
if you will. Yeah.
That's right.
It's right now we're in a situation where we have 8 Supreme Court justices. So any decision that gets to the Supreme Court, and they end up with a 4-4, it's a split, then it reverts back to what the lower courts, whatever the decision was, whether it's about voting rights or any other issue, it goes back to the lower courts, and that's what the decision holds. So you can see that having a situation where you can't get the Congress to do what their job is, the Senate in particular, right, to confirm somebody. It'll be interesting to see whether they pick up Obama's recommendation after the November election, or they wait for the new president to take office, whoever that may be. Be an interesting thing, because that has prevented a lot of things that are just sitting around and nobody's making decisions about any of it, no matter what area it touches on. Yeah.
For a new Voting Rights Act. Exactly. I think the Supreme Court agrees with you, and in fact that's what they said when they struck down Section 5, the Preclearance Act. It wasn't because racial discrimination is no longer real. That's not what the opinion says. That's of course how some people interpret it. What it really says is that it's outdated, that we need a Voting Rights Act. We need to use a Supreme Court that actually has something to say about what's really going on in the world right now, and how to affect and how to execute your right to be heard on public policy issues. And you're right, it's outdated. It has been for some time. I mean, anything written in 1965 is bound to be revisited at some time if it's still going to be, useful to us now, because times have changed. But I think you make a great point, and you're right. I think it's time to legislatively look at it again and make sure that people's rights are being protected.
So how does that start?
Well,
it could start with you guys.
That's right.
It really
Vote.
could. It's not only vote, but it's, you have elected representatives who could hear from you. that this is something that's been discussed, that why not, start to consider that. I'll give a plug to a meeting that I believe we're going to be having at St. Francis in October. I think it's the 19th, Linda, is that right? October 19th. We're going to have U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer here at night.
Oh, terrific.
And that'd be a perfect person to bring that up to, right? He certainly is the U.S. Senator for our entire state, and I would think that would be something he might be particularly interested in.
Absolutely.
And if you can't be there in person, you guys could draft a letter and send it to him, I mean, I certainly agree that was done in the 60s. Times have changed. We need to revisit it. We need to make it more open and more. We have to stop complaining about how voter turnout is so dismal and try to think about ways to increase it. And we really thank all of you, and I thank my guest. And we do want to make one more pitch. Ann Zwern is here. If any of you guys are interested in working at the polls, making money as an inspector in November, all right, what do they pay now, Ann?
When you take the class, which you'd have to contact me, you get $100 just for taking the class, but you have to pass, and then $200 to work as a poll worker. If you enjoy doing that and do it frequently, then you can get moved up to be an administrator going around to all the poll sites in a geographic area. Or the other thing about disenfranchisement is you could be a liaison to nursing homes. That we provide a liaison to go out to the nursing homes and to ensure that people who are patients there or are living there have that right. And it's not on election day. And there's other things you can do, and you get paid for all those things. You have to take class, but you get paid for all of them. Just contact me through your professor or through the provost or your other professor, and I'm happy to help you connect to that.
Okay?
Great.
Thank you very much.